Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. This is going to be a kind of fun video for me, at least, because my main area of theological interest really is theological aesthetics, theology of beauty. How do we see the beauty of God in and through all things? The Lord Jesus Christ is supremely beautiful, supremely lovely, and I really do believe his beauty permeates everything. And so this is a presentation that I plan to give at least a version of this at the bioethics conference held at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School next week. But I thought I might just put it out there just to get feedback and see what people think of this. I'm going to argue that we can understand human value and value in general as loveliness. Now, what I'll mean by that is that value or intrinsic value rather, will refer to something's potentiality to display the beauty of God. So how do I get there? Well, let's find out. Okay, so here's where we're going. First, I'm going to argue that human value, well, that's sort of my argument. Human value denotes the potentiality of human nature to display the beauty of God in the mode of image bearing. So to get there, first we're going to survey different concepts of human dignity on offer and provide some critique. Then we're going to articulate a theological account of God's purposes of creation, and that'll situate some of the relevant definitional pieces I'll use to construct this concept of value. And part three, we're going to frame value as the potentiality to display God's beauty, so value in general, intrinsic value. And then we're going to contextualize that to human nature. And then finally, I'll just conclude with some reflections on how this might start to relate human dignity with human rights. All right, so part one. So there are multiple strategies for dealing with human dignity. Ruth Macklin wrote an infamous article in the early 2000s where it's called Dignity is a Useless Concept. She argued that it doesn't really do any work. It doesn't really help us understand anything. It's conceptually useless because she argues of its religious roots. According to Steven Pinker, it's just the obligation to treat everyone as they wish. So it's a useless concept. It doesn't really do anything for us. Michael Perry similarly argues that it's inescapably religious. So we can't really do much with human dignity. And Alistair Cochrane, he's another philosopher. He argues we should separate human rights from human dignity, and he rejects what's called the founding value thesis. Now in the literature, and this is kind of intuitive in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you'll find this claim that human rights are rooted in human dignity. So because you have dignity, the claim goes, this grounds your right to certain things. It is a violation of dignity to restrict who you can marry, for instance. If consider racism, one might consider civil rights a human rights issue, and it's rooted in the dignity of all persons, such that to deny someone civil rights is in some sense a violation of their dignity. Okay, so here's the problem with dismissing human dignity. It's inevitably an object of moral concern, right? So consider civil rights. In civil rights discord or apartheid, one of the issues there was that the dignity of persons was being violated by rejecting their rights. So in specifying the particular kind of wrong that's done when we deny someone human rights, we're inevitably going to refer to human dignity in order to specify that. So, for instance, suppose I say women don't have the right to get an education, right? Like we live in a society where they're just not allowed to go to college, they're not allowed to work, or they're not allowed to do whatever, right? We might object to that as a denial of their rights, and we'll say that that's wrong because of the particular way that impinges upon their dignity, and what their dignity entitles them to. So it's inevitably an object of moral concern, and it grounds human rights. It's impossible to get around this. Okay, so if that's the case, what are some strategies for understanding human dignity? Well, Martha Nussbaum argues that we have status dignity on account of our agency. It's a particular kind of agency, namely a potentiality to strive for flourishing. So if you have agency to strive for flourishing, then you have dignity. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, she actually does explicitly deny dignity to certain persons. So if you're comatose, she would argue, yeah, they don't have actually the kind of status dignity that we refer to when we talk about human dignity. That seems to me a problem. If you think elderly people or people who are comatose or whatever have dignity, then Nussbaum's conception is going to be unworkable. Jeff McMahon, he uses this sort of argument to even argue for infanticide. Infants, they're very needy. They don't really have agency of their own yet, at least. And on that basis, McMahon argues infanticide should be legal. Peter Singer actually infamously argues this point, calls it voluntary euthanasia, which is just another word for murder, where on account of these infants not having relevant kinds of capacities, so maybe the capacity to feel pain or the capacity to feel pleasure, we might evaluate the moral status of an infant differently than my moral status. It's something you can grow in. So Peter Singer, for instance, wouldn't see a significant difference between the moral status of a human baby and an adult pig, because both have a sort of equivalent capacity to feel pain, to feel pleasure, to be objects of suffering, and those for him ground moral status. Linda Zagzebski, interestingly, is a Catholic philosopher, and she argues that self-reflective consciousness, which gets actualized in a myriad of ways, is the ground of dignity. And what she means by self-reflective consciousness is more or less the capacity to reflect on reflect on the on your actions, to take stock of them, to make judgments. Now, Zagzebski's interesting. She's a Catholic philosopher. And so she argues that what grounds it is the fact that this is a part of human nature. And because she's not a physicalist, she says this is a part of sort of the way human nature is supposed to be. So even if someone doesn't possess it, or is disabled, or is barred from it, they possess the kind of nature that has this capacity, this potential for self-reflective consciousness. And it's owing to some hindrance upon their nature that constrains their nature, that prevents them from this exercise of self-reflective consciousness, or prevents them from having self-reflective consciousness, but their nature tends towards self-reflectiveness. So my main problem with Zagzebski's account is that it's arbitrary. So, for instance, suppose we say, as we should, that human beings have the kind of nature that enable them to have a spine. Why is it that self-reflective consciousness is a more fitting ground for dignity than having a spine, than having a nose, than any other sort of a feature, normative feature of a human essence we might posit? Now, Eric Wielenberg, he's an atheist, moral philosopher. He comes up with a multiple source solution. So he posits three sources of dignity. Psychological capacities, so our ability to make poetry, to do philosophy, to create things. Symbolic value, so for instance, if you have a loved one who passes away, you bury their body, and that's a way of honoring them. Now, even though they have no psychological capacities at that point, and in some ways they're not the person that you loved, we would often say, as if you've ever been to a funeral, you kind of see that the person in the coffin isn't the person, like the person that you loved isn't there, it seems. Nevertheless, their body has a sort of symbolic value of the person that was there. So that's what we call symbolic value. Now, potential value is the sort of potentials that we might have by way of, I think, psychological capacities that might be actualized along the way as you grow. Now, the problem is that we can conceive of persons without any of these. And it seems like Wielenberg's account would force us to say that some people really just don't have any dignity. So, for instance, suppose you find a disabled baby whose family, is dead, right? Or you don't know their family. They were anonymous. And this baby has severe mental impairments. Now, this baby does not have any relevant psychological capacities. Maybe you might say, well, it has symbolic value in that it symbolizes like some sort of value of humanity or something like that. But the problem is that suppose now we can modify this, right? Suppose this baby is just on an island alone, right? So no one knows of this baby. And then potential value. So this baby, again, is in a disabled state, will probably die soon. No one will know. There probably have been people like that. It seems to me like Wielenberg would have to say something like this person has very little, if at all, intrinsic value. And certainly, as he concedes, he can't say they have an equivalent intrinsic value. So Wielenberg admits that he doesn't think that all people are equally intrinsically valuable. And he just bites that bullet. So if you're going to affirm the equal dignity of humans, his account is unworkable. And if you're going to affirm that that baby in that isolated place is intrinsically valuable and just as intrinsically valuable as me, it seems like that account is going to struggle. Okay, so what about human nature accounts? Well, Benedict XVI, he posits the image of God, and this has been a very common theme in the 20th century, as the ground of human dignity. Now here's the problem, and we're going to refer to this because I'm not going to totally reject this view, of course, but the problem is that without specification, it suffers from the similar arbitrariness problem that we saw Zagzebski's account suffer, right? Like, why is it that the image, being in the image, what is it about being in the image of God that grounds human dignity? Wolterstorff tries to answer that question. He says that God's love bestows value. So God elects to love those who are made in his image equally, and that his love for human beings, that they are objects of concern to him, equal objects of concern to him, grounds the equal dignity of human beings. Now, Jordan Wessling, in an article, he challenged that, and he argues that Wolterstorff's account suffers from a kind of euthyphro problem, right? So does God arbitrarily love that human being, or is that love grounded in that human being? In other words, could it be the case that God chose to love like a dog more than humans? And he just elected to love humans more. Now, if we say yes, that makes the love of God arbitrary. If we say no, then there's something about human nature that makes it more fitting for God to love humans more than a dog or a worm or whatever. Secular Aristotelian accounts will posit the possession of a human nature. I find those difficult because if you're a physicalist, I don't know what it means to have a human nature, right? What is it that word human nature seems on a secular metaphysic just to be a label that denotes this sort of collection of parts that we are, right? A collection of material parts organized in a given way. It's just a label that we stick on to a being that's organized in a particular way. Whoops. It doesn't, on its own, it seems insufficient to my lights. Okay, finally, status dignity. What is status dignity? Well, Susie Kilmeister and Valentini, I'm going to take them as representative samples. They don't exhaust all construals of status dignity, but they give us a good handle on this sort of concept. So for Kilmeister, status dignity is dignity that you possess by virtue of membership in some group and in virtue of being accountable to certain norms. So, for example, she has 3 different kinds. Personal dignity arises from the fact that there are certain norms an agent takes herself to be accountable to, such that if she violated those norms, she'd consider herself as in some way debased. So, for instance, suppose we think an agent like myself, let's say I count it as a norm that I ought to wear shoes to work, right? Such that I'd be debased, I'd be sort of dishonored in my own eyes if I didn't wear shoes to work. Well, the fact that I have those norms, the fact that I do, gives me status dignity. And my personal dignity can be violated insofar as those norms are violated, right? So if I don't wear those shoes, I violate my own dignity, and if someone steals my shoes, that's an attack on my dignity because it prevents me from living into these norms. Social dignity is sort of membership in a social group. Just apply that concept, and it is to adopt the certain set of norms that belong to a social group. So it's personal dignity applied to a social group of which you are a part. So for example, in America, we drive on the right side of the road. Now, it would be a violation in some sense of social dignity for me to drive on the left side of the road. It's a norm that I adopt by virtue of being a member of a certain social group. Status dignity, interestingly, is a norm imposed on members of a social group by that society. So I might adopt for myself the norms of a given social group. That's social dignity. But status dignity refers to those norms that a society imposes on me. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of what status dignity and how you might go about construing status dignity. I keep knocking over my camera. Okay, there we go. Now, Lauren Valentini, she's another philosopher. She believes that human rights discourse really only denotes a sovereign political entity's failure to secure or protect certain rights for its members. So, for instance, a sovereign political entity, particularly the right she focuses on, is the right to freedom. Now, according to her then, human rights violations, so she sort of brackets the metaphysical questions of dignity. She focuses on human rights and says, look, you have dignity, a sort of political dignity, what human dignity refers to by virtue of being a member of some sort of sovereign political entity. And that dignity cashes out to entitling you to being given the right to freedom from that governmental society. Now, suppose the government prevents you from being free in some way. So in Nazi Germany, even though there were certain Jews that were members of the German state, it prevents them it doesn't secure relevant freedoms for them. And so that's a human rights violation. That constitutes a human rights violation. And one of the consequences of her view, I emailed with her back and forth a little bit, is that a government can't violate the human rights of someone that's not under its jurisdiction. Now, they might violate the moral rights, as Valentini does affirm, but she draws a distinction between human rights and moral rights, where human rights is sort of a subset of moral rights. Now, the problem with her view, of course, is something like the Rwandan genocide, right? So the Hutus and the Tutsis, where you had one group assaulting arguably the human dignity and violating the human rights of another group that was not under its political jurisdiction. And arguably, when the US dropped an atomic bomb on Japan, many have argued that was a human rights violation. And yet, Valentini's argument here couldn't account for that because the Japanese people, as she agrees, it wouldn't classify those at least as human rights violations, although they might be moral rights violations. For her, the US couldn't violate the rights of Japan because those citizens aren't under the US's jurisdiction. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, let's bring theological resources to bear on this question. So here in part 2, we're going to resource God's goal in creation to construct our concept of value. So what was the end for which God created the world? Now, for this scriptural argument, I highly commend, and for the philosophical argument, frankly, as well, I highly commend Jonathan Edwards' The End for Which God Created the World, especially in the volume edited by John Piper, God's Passion for His Glory. I think it's an excellent, excellent work. It changed my life as a 16-year-old when I first read it. And to this day, I think it holds up quite well. I'm going to raise a related philosophical argument, but a slightly different one, to say that the end for which God created the world was the display of God's excellencies. That is, God created the world ultimately to display His beauty, to display His excellencies in the created order. And everything He does is ordered to that end. Well, why is that? Consider divine aseity, this doctrine that God does not depend on anything outside of Himself for His own existence, and divine perfection. So God is good through His own goodness, through His essential goodness. In fact, He is the form of the good, of the beautiful. All goodness and beauty derives from God's being. It's a reflection of who God is. Okay, so if that's the case, God does not depend on anything outside of Himself to be who He is, and therefore the norms that we might say, quote unquote, govern His behavior are actually internal to His nature. If that's the case, then when God seeks an end, when He has an object of intention in a choice that He makes, and He deems it a good end, the goodness through which that end is good is a reflection of God's goodness. In other words, if God sees an end as valuable, and the metric of value is reflecting God's being in some relevant way, then if God seeks an end because it is a good end to seek, it follows that God seeks some end because it is a God-reflecting end to seek. In other words, because goodness is defined by the content of God's character, value, beauty, all of these things are defined by the content of God's character. When God creates the world, He does so because He selects an end, a purpose that is good. He creates it on account of that goodness, and therefore creates it on account of some way that reflects His being. And of course, Scripture affirms that all things are from Him, through Him, and to Him. It's an all too short verse for time's sake. Again, I highly commend Jonathan Edwards here. Now, does this make God an egotist, right? So everything God does is ordered towards displaying His nature. Well, no, it doesn't, and for two reasons. First, egotism is an undue self-regard. It's an undue esteem of oneself. God can never have that. He is infinitely valuable, is infinitely good, is infinitely beautiful, and so He can never have excessive self-regard. But more importantly, it's actually metaphysically impossible for God to regard something other than Himself or creatures outside of His self-regard. Here's what I mean by that. According to the model posited here, creation, if God is a se, right, He exists just in Himself, then when He creates the world, His ideas of the world are modeled off of His own being. He's not going outside of Himself to get these ideas, these models for created things. Rather, He resources His own being as the self-existent God to create things. So creaturely being all the way down just is a display of the excellencies of God. It just is a display of his beauty. It just is a display of his goodness. And so when God loves a creature, he loves something that is a reflection of himself. Okay, but does this mean God instrumentalizes humanity? Does he step on humanity as a subordinate end to some more ultimate end of displaying his beauty? It actually doesn't mean that either. It means that when God considers a creature and seeks that creature's happiness for its own sake, which he truly does, because of what the creature is, that is identical to God seeking the display of his beauty. In other words, because a creature is a communication of the beauty of God, is a reflection of the excellencies of God, when God seeks that creature's happiness, when he seeks its well-being, its flourishing, he just is seeking the display of his beauty in the creature. Okay, so what definitions sort of emerge from this account then? God created the world to display himself, and that's typically summed up by this term glory. In the Reformed tradition especially, God created the world for his glory. And that word in the Old Testament just means the illumination of God's nature. It's the beaming forth, the making visible of who God is. So in Exodus 34, for instance, when God shows Moses his glory, God makes himself visible. He makes himself visibly known. He shines forth. And so often you see glory and light associated with each other. The image of light helps highlight this idea that glory is this revealing of God. And it's also, in a way, a concealing, because glory dazzles us, right? You can't look Yahweh in the face in Exodus 34, or you die. So glory is the dazzling shining forth of who God is. And sometimes it inspires both love and awe, and it's terrifying. It can be. In Isaiah 2, it's the glory of the Lord that rises to terrify the earth. And in that vein, then, the beauty of God, I distinguish it from glory in the following way. I believe it's an aspect of glory. It characterizes glory. God's glory is always beautiful because of the unity of God's being. But beauty uniquely engenders love. So what's interesting, and you see this in Plato's Symposium, in the last chapter of Plato's Symposium, when Socrates talks about what the object of love, it's actually beauty. Beauty engenders love in the human heart. And that's widely reflected through philosophical literature. Dietrich von Hildebrand, in The Nature of Love, makes love a value response, and in particular a response to the beauty of something. In Ficino's commentary on Plotinus as well, love is engendered by beauty. And so beauty, it strikes us in such a way that it engenders this delight that I think is the affection of love. And because it's the beauty of God, it's a yearning of our heart for a person, for fellowship with this triune God of love. But it's this experience of him that's often concealed, that we don't yet always realize is an experience of the triune God. But it is. Beauty is the experience of the God of love, engendering love, a kind of love in our hearts. Okay, so part 3. Let's use this to construct a theory of value and then human value. So, what emerges from my account here? Well, value, I think, emerges as an aesthetic concept. So if we index the value of a thing to God's purposes, and I think we should, because all of creation was created to reflect God, to reflect his beauty into the world, etc., then we might consider the value of a thing relative to God's purposes for a thing, which is, recall, to display the excellencies of God. And value is, it seems to me, it's a kind of preciousness. So it's more fittingly indexed to a sort of aesthetic concept, the concept of beauty, rather than a concept of glory, though again, of course, those are related. For von Hildebrand, value describes this sort of importance. So if something is valuable to me, maybe like a photo, right, it has a kind of importance to me. It has a preciousness to me. And importance for von Hildebrand is a metaphysical concept. In other words, it refers to a sort of thing that ought to be important to us, right? So if I have a child and my child says, "Dad, I made this painting," or it's 4-year-old art and brings it to me, right? That does have objective value in itself. Now, if I'm just like, I don't care, it should be more important to me than it is. So importance is that aspect of intrinsic value that commands and demands the sense of importance. But it demands this sort of assent of importance that's still nevertheless free in us. And as I've mentioned before, love is a kind of value response. Love hears the call that value places on the human heart and is the sort of delighted response to value. Von Hildebrand also calls beauty the fragrance of value. So this is why we describe valuable things as precious to us. 4-year-old's drawing we say is precious, or a memory we say is precious and therefore valuable. Beauty is this sort of fragrance of value, which I really love that image, that awakens this affection that is the stirring of love on the human heart. And okay, so given those things, I think this isn't an abductive argument for my thesis, but what best captures this data so far, what fits and sort of systematizes this concept of and coordinates glory, beauty, and value in the domain of God's purposes, I think, is this notion that intrinsic value is a potentiality to display God's beauty. It's the potentiality to put God on display, to display his beauty, i.e. display that which engenders love. And I focus on beauty there because God's purposes, even though we describe it rightly as glory, I think even ultimately all things are aimed at displaying God's beauty, which again is a facet of glory, but I focus there because of its correlation with delight. God puts himself on display in all things because of his delight, out of the delightedness of triune love. And then realized value is sort of the actualization of value potential. So an act of kindness has a value in itself, and it's the realization of that potentiality. So I distinguish that from intrinsic value. Okay, applied to human nature then, the potentiality to display God's beauty image-wise in the life of grace is what I argue value refers to. And by image-wise, what I mean is in the mode of image-bearing, i.e. in the mode of reflecting God's wise rule over the world, dominion, and in the mode of mediating God's presence. So images do both of those things. They communicate the rule of the one imaged. And in the ancient world, idols, interestingly, in mouth-washing ceremonies, Meredith Klein's book, Images of the Spirit, you can find this in, they were understood to mediate the divine presence in some way or another, or the presence of a deity. Humans are uniquely designed with the potentiality to reflect God's beauty into the world and to mediate his presence. And the way those two things work together is sort of like this. Suppose I learn someone's story, right? I hear maybe the story of this war veteran in World War II, and then I meet them. So my knowledge of the story of that World War II veteran, mediated by maybe the pages of a book or a storyteller, colors my encounter with that World War II veteran. In a similar way, humans were made to be sort of preparations for meeting God, in that when they actualize their potential for displaying the beauty of God, they color. They're both locuses and they color in their own lives one's encounter with God as the ruling king. So because image bearing is a matter of dominion, a matter of reflecting God's wise rule and order into the world, when someone encounters a person who is doing that in some way or another, then they are apprehending God in the light of that person, or rather they are apprehending the light of God mediated and embodied in that person, and leading them to a reality that's greater than the one mediating that light. So equality then is grounded in the equal potentiality of every human to display God's beauty in equally beautiful ways. So a person, for instance, with Down syndrome, there's a person at my church who every Easter dances on stage. They've carried the cross in. They just dance before Jesus. That is just as beautiful as anything I could do, to any praise I could offer to God, and as anyone could offer to God. So the potentiality to display God's beauty is in equally beautiful ways is present in all humans. And that allows us to affirm both, that says difference and distinction. I meant both equality and difference. Equality in terms of equal dignity, because we all have the potentiality to reflect God in equally beautiful ways, and difference because we also do it differently, but in the mode of image bearing, in the mode of reflecting God's wise rule into the world in the variety of ways that we do as human beings. So this specifies the Imago Dei concept. This allows us to give a reason why the image of God grounds human dignity. And for that reason, I think it has advantages over status accounts and other non-specified Imago Dei accounts. Well, I'm already a little bit over time. So I'll have to leave out part 4 for now for how we relate human rights to this account. But I would love feedback. What do you think? Do you think this account works? What do you think about the argument so far? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching. God bless.